Liverpool have just bought two new midfielders. Here they are, Alexis McAllister and Dominik Szoboszlai. Now they spent just south of £100 million on these two players. And when you spend that amount of money on players, you need to make sure that they fit into your system. But in order to answer that question, we need to have a think about Liverpool's midfield dynamics. But first, a history lesson. When Jurgen Klopp arrived in the Premier League 8 years ago, he was famous for saying that counter-pressing is the most important playmaker. So he turned up playing a really aggressive pressing form of football. And the idea was actually that the front press wasn't going to be too aggressive. What they were going to do, they were going to invite these passes from the opposition into the midfield space. Once that was done, once the ball had come into this space, you would then see all of the players just fall onto the ball, try and win it back and score a goal. So counter-pressing was the best playmaker. Now at first this worked fairly well. Liverpool were able to generate chances through counter-pressing, but they weren't really able to compete at the very highest level. And so Jurgen Klopp decided maybe we do need some playmakers on the pitch after all. And he did this in two ways. The first way was that he realized that if you can bring in a couple of really dynamic fullbacks, so we have Trent Alexander-Arnold on the right and Andy Robertson on the left. And because you've got a really narrow forward unit, because you want to counter-press really well, there's lots of space for these players to get into the forward areas and generate chances in that way. And now these two fullbacks have very different dynamics. So on the one hand, you've got Trent Alexander-Arnold. He's playing on the right-hand side with Mohamed Salah. Mohamed Salah is a really dangerous goal threat, so he's going to push forward into the box, try and get into as dangerous area as possible, and he's going to leave this area free in the half space. And that means that Trent Alexander-Arnold can actually pull into this space here, like this. And from here, he's going to play those really nice whipped crosses that we've all seen him play into the box. He's really dangerous in this sort of situation. And on the other side, we've got Andy Robertson, who's a really athletic runner. He's going to stay in the wide channel, get to the byline if he can, and then he's going to look to play these cutbacks into the box as well, which can be really dangerous too. And when they're attacking like this, even if Liverpool do end up losing the ball, you can see they've got plenty of players around the central spaces here, so they can turn the ball over, win it back off the opponents, and then try and score through counter-pressing as well. But attacking in this really aggressive way and then counter-pressing does leave them super exposed at the back. Now the gamble is that if you're counter-pressing is so good, these sorts of areas will never be exposed by the opposition. So if you've got good counter-pressing, then your defensive openness will be fine. So this only becomes an issue if your counter-press breaks down, and Liverpool had one of the best pressing structures in the world at this time, and so it rarely did break down. But this all changed when Jurgen Klopp tried to bring creativity in a different area, because what was happening is that teams were recognizing that Liverpool were really dangerous, and so they refused to be baited by their counter-press. They just sat deep and forced Liverpool to break them down. Now, the best way of solving that kind of problem is to bring creativity in the central midfield area. So what we saw was Liverpool brought in a player like Thiago Alcantara, for example. Now he's a much more creative player, but the problem is that it starts having an impact on your counter press. And as we said, if your counter press goes wrong, then suddenly you can start getting exposed in these sorts of areas. Which brings us up to the present day, because last season Liverpool had a nightmare, and that was largely because their counter press wasn't working. They were finding themselves exposed on the break, and that meant that they were languishing in the mid-table. Until towards the end of the season, Jurgen Klopp made a structural change that took everyone by surprise, because what he did is he moved Alexander-Arnold inside, he inverted him during possession phases, and that meant that Liverpool now were operating with a situational back three, and then they have this box shape in the midfield area here. And the general idea now is that if the ball is turned over in a counter-pressing situation, you now have a little bit more cover in the central space. So I've got a quote here from Trent Alexander-Arnold himself talking through that shift, and he starts off by saying everything was normal defensively. So he's playing as a right back, but as he carries on and says, with the ball, he wanted me, that's Jurgen Klopp, as a second number 6. So he wants to move him inside as a pivot player. The idea around it, as it was explained to me, was about improving our inside play, controlling the centre, getting an extra player in that area. He trusted me to be able to do what I needed to do to make it work. So it's not just about offering more cover defensively in case the ball's turned over, but it's also about controlling the game in the centre as well, playing as a pivot alongside Fabinho. But there's one problem here, and that is that Trent Alexander-Arnold doesn't really play as a pivot. So what do I mean by that? Well, usually when a team inverts their fullback, it gives them an extra player in the middle to help them move the ball through lines of pressure. So in this instance here, we've got a line of pressure here, and then a line of pressure here. And the idea is that with two players here, it should be easier for you to move through this line of pressure and then move the ball on to the next line of pressure. But the problem is that Alexander-Arnold doesn't usually play in these situations where he'll be facing back to his own goal and receiving the ball to his feet. And his tendency in these moments is to move away from the player behind him towards his own goal and often play the pass back as well. There's not much sense that he can turn, move the ball forward and get it through the lines of pressure. And that makes sense because he's played as a fullback his whole life, so he's used to having the ball in front of him, space around him to pass, and he is one of the most elite passers in world football. So what he tends to do is actually drop out of these situations with the ball at his feet, and then he can look to make these progressive passes from a deeper position. So here's a really nice example from that Arsenal game where Trent Alexander-Arnold first inverted, and you can see he's playing in the pivot position here alongside Fabinho. The ball is with Allister, he's going to play it into Alexander-Arnold's feet, and he's going to take a heavy touch. You can see the ball's taken away from him, and then he's just going to play it back to Konate here. So what's happened is that the ball has gone through one line of pressure, but then Alexander-Arnold has taken it back through that line of pressure. So Liverpool are back where they started from, and there's no one in this wide area to actually take advantage of that movement anyway. And so what we see from Alexander-Arnold is he starts dropping out of the centre. And so you can see him here as one of the deepest players for Liverpool because he wants to receive the ball 2 feet with all of the game in front of him, space and time around him. But crucially, he's now outside of this blocking unit of Arsenal players. So he's not really playing as a pivot player here, he's simply dropping out in order to actually maximise the things he's best at. Now it's important to realise that this isn't necessarily a bad thing because, as we've said, Alexander-Arnold has a very specific type of profile. He's a really elite ball passer, and so for him to get into these sorts of areas, so this is a game against Fulham where he's space and time on the ball and he can fire these progressive passes off between the lines, it's actually quite good. But he's not actually really playing as a pivot player, he's more playing as an inverted fullback, functioning as a deep line playmaker a bit more. And this shows up really nicely in the data. So this is the touch map from that game against Arsenal where Alexander-Arnold first inverted. And you may notice that the areas where he's picking up the ball are actually in that half space area. Rather than doing a huge amount of build-up play in the middle, he's actually picking up the ball in that half space, which is really good for him because it opens up a lot more passing angles for him, but also it allows him to push forward down the field into this area that we said he likes to get into anyway when his team are advanced. So what we're seeing here is actually an inversion of Trent Alexander-Arnold a little bit earlier in the play. He's coming inside, helping out with the build-up, helping out with those progressive passes through the middle, and then moving forward as his team moves forward. But inverting your fullback doesn't just help you progress the ball in the central spaces. Actually, what it does is it creates space in the wide areas as well that you can exploit. So with Alexander-Arnold coming inside, the wide player on his side will often pull across. And because you have a situational back three here, your build-up structure is much narrower. That's going to force the opposition much narrower as well. And that opens up space in the wide areas here and here. The idea is that means that if you're building up from the back, the ball comes to your outside centre-back, and you should have a wide player here able to drop in and pick the ball up. But this is also a problem for two reasons. The first one is that Mohamed Salah is not necessarily a great back-to-goal receiver. He doesn't often like to drop in like this to pick the ball up. He actually likes to get the ball in front of him and run towards goal. And the other thing is that if you're playing in this way and receiving the ball in these sorts of areas, you've got a player like Mo Salah, who's one of your most dangerous players, now a long, long way away from the goal. Here's a really nice example of that from the Fulham game. So here's Konate playing as the outside centre-back. And because Alexander-Arnold is inside, it's generated a lot of compaction in the opposition. There's space open here that Konate can actually make the most of. He's going to play the ball into that space, and Mohamed Salah is going to drop in and pick the ball up. Now, in this situation, what you want to happen is the winger to play the ball into the pivot player, who can then find the wide centre midfielder here in space. But the problem is that Mohamed Salah takes one too many touches, and he can't play the ball very nicely to Trent Alexander-Arnold. When Alexander-Arnold does get the ball, rather than playing the ball through to Henderson, which is just about on as a pass, he actually just plays it straight out of play. So you have the advantages that you're getting from an inverted fullback, but Liverpool aren't really enjoying those benefits that you get from that. But there is another solution here. Rather than having someone like Mohamed Salah dropping in, what you can do is you can use your centre midfielders to drop in and help out, and that means that you can keep your attacking players much closer to the goal. So this is something that we've seen from Henderson. We also saw it from Jones on the other side as well. Now the issue here is that if you're using your centre midfielders in the wide build-up, if they play the ball inside and the ball's turned over, there's now a big gaping hole in the centre midfield. It's going to make your counter press much harder to do, so the ball's going to come straight back through the middle. And even though you've got Alexander-Arnold now helping out, you ideally don't want that to happen. You want to keep the ball in this part of the pitch as long as possible. Here's a data viz which shows it quite nicely. This is all of Curtis Jones's touches from the Premier League. He spent most of the end of the season playing as one of the centre midfielders on the left-hand side, and as you can see, the majority of his touches are being taken in these wide areas. So by moving the centre midfielders out wide, the forward players can stay in a more advanced position, but as we can see, there's more space opening out in the middle of the field. So what happens if we replace Curtis Jones and Jordan Henderson with these new signings? So we've got McAllister and Szoboszlai here. How will they fit into this system in particular? So as we've said, in Liverpool's new structure, you're no longer getting width from your fullback. You've got Alexander-Arnold inside, and Robertson has to hang back a little, and that means that the centre midfielders have to offer the width. And the problem here is that using Liverpool's new signings as essentially width-holding centre midfielders is a real waste of their talents, particularly when it comes to Dominik Szoboszlai, who you want to get up around the edge of the box so that he can get shots away and be creative in those sorts of areas. which isn't to say that either of these players couldn't play as width-providing centre midfielders. So for example, here's a map of Dominik Szoboszlai's minutes for RB Leipzig per position, and as you can see, he's got a huge amount of time in these wide right areas, which is where he would be covering for Trent Alexander-Arnold if Alexander-Arnold was going to be inverting. But all of this is adding up to raise the question whether or not Liverpool should stick with their new system, because actually what we started to see is that the pros of this system are starting to be outweighed by the cons. So on the pro side of the board, there are definite advantages to moving Trent Alexander-Arnold inside. You've got more cover in defensive transition, and actually moving Alexander-Arnold inside opens up a huge amount of passing options to him. But then over on the con side of the board, we've already talked about how Alexander-Arnold isn't really a pivot player. Robertson is definitely not an outside centre-back, and as we've said, Liverpool's wingers aren't back-to-goal receivers, so they're not necessarily going to exploit the wide areas as well as they should, and doing that anyway will move them further away from the goal. And this means that all of the width has to come from those central midfielders, which moves them away from the central part of the pitch. So maybe the solution here is that Liverpool could move back to their original 4-3-3 shape. As we said, they moved away from that structure because they weren't able to counter-press well. But if they brought in two new number 8s, maybe they can counter-press better, and that could move Liverpool back to their original shape. And if that does work out, then you have your 8 now in a much more central position, so you should be able to get more of the attacking upside from both Szoboszlai and McAllister. But the big question is, can they press? What are the Liverpool centre midfielders expected to do during a pressing sequence? So I've got a really nice example of that here. This is early on in an Aston Villa game, and as we can see, this is the Liverpool front line. You can see that the wide players are very narrow because you want to counter press in the middle, and then you have the two centre midfielders here ready to jump forward if they need to. And the trigger for that jump is the goalkeeper passing the ball into the pivot players. You can see here, both Henderson and Curtis Jones are triggered by that pass. They're going to jump onto this player here, make it really hard for them to build up. Now, immediately as the ball comes into the pivot player, he knows that that pressure is coming, so he's going to play it out to the centre back over here. And as you can see now, Liverpool's front three are still in that very narrow configuration, but it's Curtis Jones, one of the central midfielders, whose job it is to follow that ball up, keep the press going really aggressively. But notice how far Curtis Jones has then moved. He started off over here, and he's had to just jump all the way up to the centre back right on the byline as well. So this is a huge amount of pressing intensity that is required from Liverpool's two new players. So can McAllister and Szoboszlai press? Well, we've got the pizza charts on the board here, and as you can see, in the defensive areas, they've got big chunks of red. But what does that actually mean? So I've got the definitions in front of me here. So let's start with defending impact. So this shows the impact of a player's defending towards the opposition progressing the ball. So that's really important if you're talking about a player pressing up against an opposition player trying to build the ball forward. So let's have a look at the defending impact of both players. And as you can see, both of them have really good numbers. So we've got 73 here for Alexis McAllister and then 61 for Dominik Szoboszlai. So both of these players look like they've got a huge amount of upside to offer when it comes to stepping up in those pressing moments. And then the second metric we've got here is disrupting opposition moves. So this one says the higher this number, the more the player disrupts opposition moves through tackling, fouling, blocking and clearing per minute out of possession. So both of these players have got really nice numbers in these areas respectively. Dominik Szoboszlai is playing for a Red Bull team, so you can see he's got a really big chunk of red in this area. Slightly down for Alexis McAllister, but then Brighton aren't exactly famous for their really disruptive pressing. It is worth noting with Szoboszlai that he's got a really low number here for this defending intensity metric. So let's just take a look at what that means. So as you can see, defending intensity shows how often the player is the most relevant defender when his side are out of possession. Now, for Dominik Szoboszlai to be not that particularly relevant for a Red Bull team, it's probably not that surprising. So this doesn't suggest that we have anything to worry about here either. So can McAllister and Szoboszlai play together in the same Liverpool team next season? Well, I think it's clear from what we've seen that they can play in both systems. They can play in Liverpool's new structure, or they could help them move back to the old structure. The big question is, which one suits them better? In the most recent system, they'd have to be playing as width-providing central midfielders. And it's my opinion that that's actually reducing the upside that Liverpool could get from those two players. So maybe what we'll see is Liverpool moving back to that old system, using the fullbacks for width and keeping their central midfielders much closer together. The big thing is, if Szoboszlai and McAllister are going to be really good out of possession, this should be absolutely fine for them too.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including journalists dedicated to each Premier League team, so every fan gets the coverage they deserve, not just the big clubs. And you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.